Now, some of you may not be feminist. You may think that's fine, but I am a feminist. And I think there's a crisis in feminism posed by what I think of as gender ideology. We're talking as if changing your sex was a literal possibility, either through sex or hormones, but even more bizarrely, through just saying things. You could change your sex. You could become a woman just by saying, I'm a woman. So I just thought that this was all nonsense. Philosophically, it made no sense. And there was a third reason for my interest, which is that I was and am a non-man attracted to a non-men. In other words, I'm a lesbian. So I am part of the so-called LGBT community, which is not really a community, in whose name these ideas are being advanced. So this leaves room for a critique from both the left and the right, because this liberalism is in the left and the right already. I'm going to quickly summarize two different approaches to feminism coming out of this, one from the left, one from the right, both of which reject gender ideology, and both of which call themselves feminist. So on the left, we've got something like radical feminism, which takes inspiration from the second wave, people like Shulamith Firestone, Kate Millett, Andrea Dworkin, and so on. Now, radical feminists, I think, are more naturally see themselves as on the left than the right, although they might deny that now because they're so fed up with the left. But in that case, they tend to say that they're politically homeless. They put an emphasis on the biological as the kind of substrata of culture, and of feminine culture and masculine culture, as before. And in that emphasis on biology, they're in good company with Marx, for instance, who really insisted that there were biological facts about human beings. These feminists are likely to emphasize sexual dimorphism. Men are bigger, stronger, faster, on average, than women. And they are likely to emphasize the reproductive differences between men and women because they think that those biological differences are the source of women's oppression by men. So they think that biological differences between males and females in the human species give rise to the capacity of men to physically dominate women, to sexually assault them, and it also gives rise to what they would think of as men's exploitative relationship with women's reproductive labor. That is, the using of women for sexual pleasure, the using of women to produce their babies and to raise their babies and to look after the entire domestic sphere, the keeping of women in the domestic sphere. All of that, they think, serves men and their interests economically and practically. So these feminists are likely to be against all forms of female exploitation based on their biological status, and they're critical of the capitalist commodification of the body. They're against prostitution, pornography, commercial surrogacy, sexual objectification of the body. All of that, they think of that as deeply exploitative to women, but it's all based on an acknowledgement of the difference, the biological differences between men and women. Some of them are also against heterosexual marriage because they think that that's exploitative too. They will certainly reject the idea of choice feminism. Prostitution is terrible whether or not you want to do it. It's still terrible. They think there are preferences that you develop in a patriarchal society that are bad for you. And they're very critical of equality narratives as well, from liberal feminism about like making everything the same, because they think, well, we're not the same, we're different, physically different. I think you can probably see, I'm not going to labour the point, but there's obviously a reference to biology in that worldview that you can't get rid of. The whole structure depends on there being differences. So they will reject gender ideology on that basis. They will say gender ideology erases biological difference, erases all the forms of exploitation of women based on biological difference, and they think of it as gender ideology as basically misogynist because it sexually objectifies women and it makes womanhood into a costume, like to be worn by men, a feminized costume to be worn by men. So there is room on the left, I think, for a feminism that does not embrace gender ideology. But what about the right? Okay, is there any room on the right for feminism? I think that's the question. There are now thinkers like Mary Harrington or Louise Perry, or Catholic feminists like Erika Bachiochi and Abigail Favale. They've all written books. They think of themselves, I think, on the right. They totally reject gender ideology, but they take a kind of different perspective on some of these issues. They all agree that there's misogyny in the world and exploitation of women, so they agree with the radical feminists about that. They think there should be a women's movement to counter the exploitation of women. And they have other commonalities with radical feminists too. So they emphasize sexual difference. They are critical of equality narratives, which disguise sexual difference. They're critical of capitalism. They're critical of the commodification of women's bodies. They're critical of prostitution, pornography, commercial surrogacy, all of that. So they share that with the radical feminists. And they also think of the norms of male sexual behavior as being bad for women. This is where they start to come apart from the radical feminists, but they're very critical of the sexual revolution of the 1960s because they think it had a totally detrimental effect on women's sexuality. Hill basically allowed, according to them, women to start having the kind of sex that men wanted from them, which was commitment-free, promiscuous, and involved whatever kinks the men were into. And they think this was not good for women. Abortion, they think, also freed up both men and women from the consequences of sex and produced widespread cultural changes in sexual behavior that were neither good for men nor women. And unlike radical feminists, these women are very sympathetic towards the traditional heterosexual family because they think that marriage is a way for women to exist in relation to men and to children in a non-commodified, non-capitalist relational way, like a caring, nurturing relationship that doesn't involve transaction, whereas liberalism is sort of forcing us into a position eventually where everything's transactional, they would say. I'm racing through this, but that's the left and the right, and both of them are putting up resistance to gender ideology, and both of them are calling themselves feminists. So I'm just going to finish by making some kind of half-assed observations. I mean, I was thinking about this today, and I was thinking, is there any sort of neat way of framing this? And I think, so here's what I could try. So gender ideology clearly thinks there's really nothing natural at all in human relations, or at least in sexual relations. You know, it's all culture, all the way down, even to the point that there's no such thing as biology, really. We can just kind of construct it any way we like. There can be 7 sexes or 2, 72 genders or none. You know, it's all done with words. Okay, so forget that, that's clearly crazy. What do the other two say? What does radical feminism say? Well, I think radical feminism clearly says there is nature, we are natural, there's sexual dimorphism, we're differently built, different reproductive capacities. But I think they think that we should be suspicious of the natural because it's dangerous for women. So natural difference produces a hostile environment for females, I think they think. You know, it basically makes us susceptible to being raped, to being carried off, to being assaulted. The kind of activist element would be to alter culture to protect women from men. The danger came from the biology, as it were, and now we need to kind of tame men into like not exploiting us, and we need to set up institutions that prevent our labor from being exploited and stuff like that. So the emphasis towards nature is essentially suspicious. But this other kind of feminism, which I forgot to tell you, they call reactionary feminism. Basically, Mary Harrington would call herself a reactionary feminist. I think they think culture is the thing that's suspicious. Technology is suspicious. The pill has messed us up. Abortion has messed us up. I think they essentially think nature is more benign, and that there's something kind of more nurturing and natural, and the closer we get to nature, sort of the better relationships between men and women will be. So that if that's right, and I haven't run it by them, but you know, if that's right, that's a really different framing of the nature-culture split. And I guess because a lot of the reactionary feminists are theists, I guess it would fit with a kind of, if you're a theist, if you think God created nature, I guess you're more likely to think that it's basically okay. If you think there's no God, the world is just this feral, savage place where males aggress females, then you're more likely to think of nature as something we have to tame and be frightened of. So that's my kind of, I don't know what you call it, kind of open-minded kind of critique. I'm trying to think through like what is going on here, and that's as far as I've got. But I will stop there. Thank you very much. Oh, okay. So I'm gonna chair questions if there are any. Yes.